Vagabond has some of the greatest story arcs in any manga I've ever seen in my entire life. I can name 5 arcs at least off the top of my head that I could include in my top 10. Some arcs alone can stand as stories of their own, and great stories of their own, because to be quite honest, Vagabond is so consistent with every single arc that it almost seems like you can't really pick a single arc out of the many to call it the best one, because there are so many you can consider to be the best. But I think a common consensus in the manga community is that the Farmland arc is Vagabond's best arc. Now this is very controversial because having many arcs in the story, having many great arcs in the story, obviously means that many people are going to disagree with you. That's fine. I just feel like the Farmland arc is the most talked about arc in Vagabond, and for good reason, because it is unlike any of the other arcs in the story, and it is truly the best example I can find in a manga of how to develop and grow a character, being Musashi. It is truly one of the most impactful and developmental arcs in all of manga, and I could keep on giving it compliments, but I think it's best if I get into the video. What's funny is that some people, some foolish people, will say that this arc is slow and boring and that it's not good. These kinds of people do not deserve the beauty of Vagabond because they simply see this manga as a battle shonen being disguised as a philosophical seinen manga. That is absolute blasphemy. And if you think that, bro, you are not smart. Most arcs in manga have a rising action, a climax, and a falling action, and of course a conclusion. Now this is kind of essential to any arc in any story. That's like the basic fundamental of writing a story. But the Farmland arc is sort of different in that way. Not only is it different in the way that an arc is supposed to be created, it's different in the way the characters are formatted. Now by that I mean most arcs have a protagonist, an antagonist, a few side characters, and a strong plot to build up that climax. There may be some fight moments, there may be deaths, there may be incredible character moments, plot twists, reveals. That's all normal for arcs in a story because that's what makes a story so appealing. Of course, the main goal of any story arc is to develop the narrative. It's to push the narrative and continue pushing the characters forward so that the story may reach its final endpoint. This is all what you would expect from a typical arc in any kind of medium, not only in manga but in books in general, in movies, in TV shows, and basically anything. But for the first time, when I looked into the Farmland arc, this wasn't the same experience. I didn't experience the same emotions that I would feel from other arcs. I didn't experience the same events or the same character moments. It was very different. We didn't really get much of a rising action, a climax. I mean, we sort of did because it is essential to every arc and every story, but it was unlike any other arc in any story I've ever seen. It wasn't necessarily focused on driving the narrative and pushing the story towards its endpoint. It's almost as if everything the story had built up until now had just paused and stopped, and we were moving into a completely different part of the story, into like a portal that had nothing to do with everything that was built up from the story so far. It's as if this arc in Vagabond is a story of its own. It is a manga of its own. There's no real plot, and it's hardly like a story. It's more like a journey, and it instead becomes something more like a single perspective into a character and a very introspective dive into the main character being Musashi. Everything in this arc is told through Musashi's perspective, which is unlike any other part of Vagabond. In the other parts of Vagabond, we get the perspectives of Kojiro, Marahachi, even at times side characters like Denchichiro, Seijiro. This entire arc is always on Musashi. There may be entire arcs and stories where the focus is another character. The focus is on developing a different character, and most of the time at the end the character will die, because once you develop a side character you tend to remove him because he has nowhere else left to go in the story. That is a very specific case, but with Musashi in this case, this is what everything he has done in the story has led up to until now, and yet it feels like the story could have started in this way. Because what's so cool is that Musashi grew more in this Farmland arc than he did from the entire story up until now. Obviously he has grown an incredible amount since the story of Vagabond began. That is completely clear to see, but this Farmland arc pushes his character into sort of like his final form. The beginning of the Farmland arc starts at chapter 302 and ends at chapter 322. And to prove my point further of this being sort of like a different journey and a different path in the story of Vagabond, being like a completely separate section of its own, this is proven by the title of chapter 301. It is called Path's End because from 1 to 301, the entire path Musashi has taken is a path through the way of the sword. And on chapter 301, that path comes to an end. The next chapter begins a different path, which is the farming arc. This arc is a different path for Musashi. It teaches him different lessons, and he sees different things than he has seen in his life previously. It is a shift not only for Musashi but for the reader as well, because up until now the reader has been flooded with incredible fights and development of side characters and of Musashi himself. But instead of fighting, and instead of the crazy artwork and display panels we have seen before, we are thrown into this simple world of just a farm, just a number of poor people, and Miyamoto Musashi. That is all we have. And with the very limited resources of this arc in terms of its characters and in terms of its setting, Inoue makes this arc the best arc in Vagabond in terms of Musashi's character. Again, it's unlike any other part of the story. It's an arc of its own. There is no fighting. There is no becoming invincible, which was Musashi's goal from the beginning. There are no opponents like Denshichiro, Seijiro, the Yoshioka, the Hozoin. No opponents. There is no Kojiro at all. Because again, Kojiro is not the focus of this arc, it is all Musashi. The only thing that really happens in this arc that drives Musashi is self-improvement. That is the entire purpose of the Farmland arc in Vagabond. It is not to beat other people down, it is not to cut people down, it is to grow oneself and to develop oneself's character, to become a better person in a different way than you have pursued your entire life. Musashi had wasted 22 years to find the real answer, and he had still not found it, but what he realized was he only found the answer when he stepped out of the circle. This idea of the circle is beautifully shown in the Wandering arc, which is the arc that comes before the Farmland arc, where Musashi draws the circle and asks fellow swordsmen to come inside if they want to cut him down. This circle represents the cycle of hatred and the cycle of fighting in the feudal Japan era. Musashi realizes this, and during the Farmland arc is when he finds his answer to his question, what does it mean to be strong? He was constantly inside of the circle, wandering inside of the circle, wondering what the answer to the question was, when the real answer lay in stepping out of the circle and viewing the entirety of it. Instead of being preoccupied with the single tree, Musashi stepped out of the circle and saw the entire forest, and by seeing the entire forest, he saw the grand perspective of his entire journey, and he learned the real reason why he was weak the entire time and why he had truly wasted 22 years of his life pursuing something that was meaningless and that was like a heat haze. Instead, when he steps out of the circle, he finds his true meaning of strength. To have a mind that does not sway while continuing to move and change. Bro, Vagabond is literally the best. We also get to see and experience a different setting, which I mentioned briefly at the beginning of the video. We get to see the impact of being poor, and we get to see the situation that a tiny village in this big, vast world really has to experience, because all we really see is just people cutting each other down because it's a swordsman's story. But this arc shows us the perspective of people who have nothing to do with the sword, people who are simply living out their lives in peace in this village, struggling to survive because there is no food and they need to plant their own food. Musashi, a character who has no obligation to help these people, who has really had no reason to help anyone his entire life because his entire life has been killing people, not helping them. He instead chooses to help these people and to help himself. He's constantly bombarded with people asking him to come to their temples to help them learn the way of the sword. But Musashi constantly rejects these people because his true motive is to learn, and it is to become stronger. He becomes stronger through farming more than he becomes stronger through swinging the sword. Think about how incredible that is. It puts the seemingly omnipotent character of Musashi into a situation where it seems like he is helpless. And that makes a lot of sense because he is great at swinging the sword, but he is not so great at swinging the hoe. It shows his true weakness because he constantly pursued one thing his entire life. He was preoccupied on a single tree being the way of the sword, and so he missed the entire forest. the forest being symbolized through a farming arc. These subtle things that Inoue does in his stories, man. Now, of course, we see how far Musashi's come in this arc because it is, like, quite honestly the final arc of the story, because the one that comes after this is still on hiatus. But we see how far Musashi's come through his entire journey. An example of this is in chapter 302, which is the premiere of this arc, is where he's shocked how this little kid named Iori is about to stab his own father, who's pretty much already dead. But he can't carry him to the grave because he's too heavy, so he's gonna chop him up and carry his pieces to the grave. But Musashi is shocked at how this kid would dare cut down his own father after he's been dead. But as he goes to bed that night, he wonders about himself in the past, and he remembers people calling him Demon Child, and he remembers that a lot of his goal as a child was to kill his own father, and he's shocked and thinks, I used to want to kill my own father too, just showing that he's progressing so much as a person. Again, the meaning of strength was not achieved on the battlefield. The meaning of strength was achieved once he stepped out of the battlefield, and he learned the meaning of strength being, again, as I mentioned, having a mind that doesn't sway while continuing to move and change. A way we get to really see Musashi grow is through the eyes of Shusaku, who's another character who grows incredibly in this arc, and he's just an old man with pretty much one foot in the grave, but by the time he dies, he becomes a completely different person by being in Musashi's presence, which really shows you how different Musashi is from all the other swordsmen, and how these experiences of becoming invincible have changed him as a person. There's philosophy, there's stoicism, and to be quite honest, there's just genius. That's the best way to describe it. Genius. The farming arc in Vagabond is one of the greatest, one of the most influential and important arcs in all of manga, and it is probably the best example of how to write and develop a character perfectly. I love this arc, it's perfect, and I hope this video shone light on that fact. That's it for me. Take care.